The Symphony of Screams. Death from birth, she composed a symphony that moved the entire world to tears. The Silence Before the Storm. Royal Festival Hall, London, a Friday evening in November. The concert hall was packed to its last seat, and nobody in it could quite believe what they were about to witness. 1,200 people had bought tickets to this premiere. Critics had flown in from Berlin, Vienna, and New York. The BBC had set up cameras in the balcony. The BBC, who almost never filmed contemporary premieres of new orchestral work, had sent a producer and 2 camera operators and a sound engineer, the last of whom had arrived that afternoon and spent 2 hours calibrating his equipment for a performance unlike anything he had been asked to record before. Because the woman who had written the symphony about to be performed had never heard a single note of it. She had never heard anything at all. Her name was Nadia Rose Clarke. She was 31 years old. She had been profoundly deaf since birth, a condition so complete that she had not even the residual hearing that some deaf people retain, the faintest vibration at the extreme edge of frequency. For Nadia, the world had always been a place of pure, unbroken, absolute silence. And yet, on the program in the laps of those 1,200 people, on the posters outside the Royal Festival Hall, on the BBC website where the live stream was already gathering viewers from 43 countries, the title of the evening's work was printed in clean black letters. Scream, a symphony in 4 movements, composed by Nadia Rose Clarke. In the front row, Nadia sat with her hands folded in her lap and her eyes on the stage. She could not hear the murmur of the audience around her. She could not hear the rustle of programs or the creak of seats or the distant warming up of the orchestra behind the closed stage door. What she could feel, through the soles of her shoes pressed flat against the concert hall floor, was the low, magnificent vibration of 1,200 people breathing in the same room. She closed her eyes. She had been feeling vibrations all her life. She had spent 31 years learning their language. Tonight, for the first time, the world would speak it back. Who is Nadia Rose Pemberton, Sheffield, England, growing up in the architecture of silence? Nadia's parents had been told, very gently, by the specialist at Sheffield Children's Hospital when Nadia was 4 months old, that their daughter would never hear them say her name. Her mother, Anne, was a secondary school music teacher. Her father, David, played the piano badly but with great enthusiasm at parish events and called it a talent. The diagnosis had arrived with the particular cruelty of great precision. They would never be able to share music with their daughter. Not the piano in the front room, not the radio in the kitchen, not the lullabies Anne had already been composing in her head during the pregnancy. What Nadia's parents did not yet know was that their daughter had already begun composing her own. She grew up in a semi-detached house in Hillsborough, the third of 4 children, the only one who could not hear the other 3 arguing through the walls. She learned to sign and to lip read with the extraordinary precision of someone whose entire social intelligence had been rerouted through her eyes. She was bright, specific, and, her primary school teacher's words written in a report when Nadia was 7, possessed of an attention to the physical world that seems almost scientific in its intensity. This was the teacher's way of saying, Nadia touched everything, not randomly, not obsessively, but with a deliberate and focused attention. She pressed her palm to the window pane when it rained to feel the droplets' impact. She lay on the wooden floor of the school hall when the upper years had PE and felt the vibrations of 50 running feet. She sat with her back against the music room wall on Tuesday afternoons when Mrs. Cooper's Year 9 class had choir practice and felt the particular quality of massed human voices through the plaster and brick, a warmth that was nothing like sound and entirely like something she had no word for. It was her mother who first understood. Anne came home one evening to find Nadia, 10 years old, lying on her back beneath the upright piano in the front room, eyes closed, one hand resting on the soundboard while Anne's piano student played scales in the room above. Nadia had felt Anne's approach and opened her eyes without alarm. Anne, what are you doing, love? Nadia, learning the notes. Anne had stood in the doorway for a long time after that. Then she had sat down beside her daughter on the floor, placed her own hand next to Nadia's on the soundboard, and played the scales again. This time they learned them together. Background: the language nobody taught her. Sheffield and Leeds, ages 15 to 22. By 15, Nadia had a system. She had developed it herself, without instruction, with the methodical patience of someone who has always had to invent her own tools because the existing ones were designed for different hands. She borrowed her mother's old cello. Anne had played it through university and kept it in the cupboard under the stairs with the sentiment but not the intention of playing it again. Nadia did not play it in the conventional sense. She pressed it against her ribcage and had her sister draw the bow across the strings while she stood very still with her eyes closed, mapping what she felt. The cello, she discovered, was extraordinary. Each note created a different quality of vibration, not just in frequency, but in texture, in weight, in the way it settled or leaped or faded. The low C was a darkness in the chest, a pressure that felt like something held. The high A was thin and urgent, almost sharp against the sternum. The D string in the middle register felt to Nadia like sunlight through glass, specific, directional, warm. She began to write. Not music in the first instance. She had no notation. She wrote in a journal with a vocabulary she invented: chest pressure, shoulder lift, sternum bright, rib cage hollow. She created a dictionary of physical sensation, a map of the invisible country she had been living in all her life. At 17, she enrolled at the Sheffield College of Music on a composition course. She was the first deaf student they had accepted. She was also, her composition tutor would later say in a newspaper interview, one of the 2 or 3 most gifted students he had taught in 25 years. But gifted was not the same as welcome. The music school was not cruel. Cruelty would have been easier to fight. It was simply uncertain. Uncertain how to assess work it couldn't evaluate through the usual means. Uncertain whether a student who could not hear the output of her compositions could truly be said to be composing them. There were conversations Nadia was not part of, about whether the accommodation she required was fair to students who had earned their places through audition. She heard about these conversations through the grapevine of the other students, who told her with the mixture of loyalty and awkwardness of people sharing something they think you should know, but aren't sure how to say. She graduated. She received, in her degree show, the lowest assessment of any composition student in her year. The panel had found her work, 3 pieces for string quartet, composed through the haptic method she had developed, technically innovative but experientially limited. Their word, limited. She was 22. She moved to Leeds. She kept composing. 4. Rising conflict. The world closes its ears. Leeds and London, ages 22 to 28. The years that followed her graduation were the years of the closed doors. Not slammed, she would have preferred that. Closed, with a quiet and unarguable click, one after another. She applied for a residency at a London Contemporary Music Foundation and was rejected. The rejection letter was encouraging and specific. Her compositional approach was of genuine interest, her haptic methodology intellectually compelling, but the Foundation's program was focused on composers who could participate fully in the collaborative sonic environment of the residency. They meant, and she understood perfectly, we do not know what to do with someone who cannot hear the work as it happens. She applied for a BBC commission, rejected. A Northern Music Trust development grant, rejected. An Arts Council project fund, rejected, with feedback noting that while her personal narrative was powerful, the panel had concerns about her ability to deliver a performable work at professional standard. The feedback kept using variations of the same word: concern. Concern about delivery, concern about standard, concern about her ability to do the thing she had been doing alone, by feel, since she was 15 years old and lying on the floor beneath her mother's piano. She was working as a teaching assistant at a Leeds primary school during the days, signing for a deaf pupil in year 4, and composing at night. She had no studio. She had the dining table, her laptop running notation software with a haptic feedback interface she had configured herself, and the old cello propped against the wall. A percussionist named Ben Hughes, who played with the Leeds Philharmonic and moonlighted teaching drum kit to beginners at the community center, became her collaborator. Not because he was qualified to help her, he was not, and was clear about this, but because he came to one of the informal workshops she ran occasionally at the Deaf Community Center and watched her demonstrate the haptic mapping of a double bass and understood immediately that she was watching something she had no framework for, and that this meant it was worth paying attention to. They worked together for 3 years. She composed, he played, and described what he was playing not in terms of sound, but in terms of what she might feel, the physical properties of the instrument, the air movement, the vibration in the floor, the temperature of the string. She refined her notations. The work became more complex, more confident, more structurally ambitious. At 27, she completed the first draft of a full orchestral work. 4 movements, 70 minutes, written for a symphony orchestra of 80 musicians. She called it Scream because she had spent her entire adult life being told quietly and politely and with great regret that she had nothing worth saying. The title was not aggressive, it was simply accurate. She sent it to 19 conductors and 4 concert promoters. She received 11 rejections, 4 acknowledgments with no follow-up, and 4 silences that she chose to interpret as the universe inviting her to continue. She continued. 5. Lowest point. The night she nearly stopped. Leeds, a Tuesday in January. The night she came closest to stopping was a Tuesday in January, the winter she was 28. She had received the 19th rejection that morning. This one had been the most considered, which somehow made it the worst. The conductor, a well-regarded woman whose name Nadia had known since she was a student, had written a personal note alongside the standard refusal. I have looked at your score with genuine care. The compositional instinct is exceptional, but I cannot in good conscience program a work that I am unable to assess through its primary medium. I would be performing something I cannot fully understand. I do not believe that is fair to your work, to my orchestra, or to the audience. I am sorry. Nadia had read the letter 3 times at the kitchen table. Then she had put it face down on the table and sat very still for a long time. She was not angry. She had been angry before in the earlier years and had learnt that anger was a clean fuel but an inefficient one. It burned hot and fast and left you cold. What she felt now was something more precise than anger, something closer to the realization that she had been fighting the wrong battle. She had been trying to convince people that her music was worth hearing, but the conductor's letter had named in its careful and well-meaning way the actual problem. People could not assess what they could not hear through the tools they had. She was not asking them to hear differently. She was asking them to hear what she had composed with the same ears they used for everything else, and then trust her that it was worth something. That was never going to work. She went to her bedroom and lay on the floor beside the cello for a long time. The flat was above a gym, and at 8 o'clock on a Tuesday evening, the spin class downstairs was at full intensity. She could feel the bass of the instructor's soundtrack through the floorboards. She pressed her palms flat against the wood and closed her eyes. She lay there for an hour. She did not make any decisions. She simply lay there and felt the vibrations of the world below her, the rhythm of dozens of people working their bodies in the dark. Then she got up. She sat at the dining table. She opened her laptop. She did not revise the score. She wrote an email. It was the most honest document she had ever written. 6. Turning point. The email that changed everything. Leeds to London. A new approach. The email was addressed to the chief executive of the South Bank Centre in London. It ran to 4 paragraphs. In the first, Nadia explained who she was and what she had composed. In the second, she explained her compositional method in precise, unsentimental terms, not as a human interest story, not as an inspirational narrative, but as a technical description of a working method. In the third paragraph, she made a proposal unlike any she had made before. She was not asking them to program her work because of who she was. She was not asking them to take a risk on an unproven composer. She was proposing an experiment, a research partnership with the South Bank Centre and the BBC Philharmonic to workshop the symphony with an orchestra, with Nadia present and directing through an interpreter, with the explicit goal of testing whether a deaf composer, working through haptic methodology, could produce a fully performable orchestral work to professional standard. She was asking them not to believe in her. She was asking them to find out. In the fourth paragraph, she said, "The work is called Scream. I named it that because I have spent 6 years being told by people who have not read the score that I have nothing to say. I believe this experiment will demonstrate otherwise, but more importantly, I believe the question itself is worth asking. Whether or not they program the work at the end, the answer to that question will tell us something the music industry does not yet know about the nature of composition and the nature of hearing." She sent it at 11:40 p.m. on a Tuesday night. She went to bed. She received a reply at 9:12 a.m. the following Thursday morning from the chief executive herself. The reply was 3 sentences. "We have read your score. We have read your email. Please call me today." The workshop partnership lasted 4 months. The BBC Philharmonic's principal cellist, a woman named Priya Sharma, was assigned to work directly with Nadia on haptic translation of the orchestral texture, describing each section's physical properties, from the warmth of the horn section to the electric sharpness of the violins in the upper register, in terms that mapped to Nadia's compositional language. A conductor named James Okafa, who had an interest in experimental music and who read the score and said simply, "This is extraordinary," agreed to lead the workshops. The workshop sessions were unlike anything any of the musicians had experienced. Nadia attended every one. She sat in the front of the rehearsal room with her feet flat on the floor and her hands on the back of a cello laid across the chair beside her. She communicated through Dr. Sharma, who had learned enough of Nadia's notation system to translate between the physical language of the score and the questions the orchestra needed answered. There were problems. Of course there were problems. The third movement, the one Nadia had felt most clearly, a piece she described in her notes as the sensation of air rushing into a room that has been vacuum sealed, was proving difficult to translate from her internal experience to the orchestra's execution. The strings were playing what was notated, but something was wrong. She could feel it in the floor. The vibration pattern was not what she had mapped. She spent a week with Dr. Sharma going through the movement bar by bar, rebuilding the notation from her haptic library. At the end of the week, the orchestra played it again. Nadia stood with her back against the rehearsal room wall and felt the movement pass through the brick and plaster and into her spine. She turned around and signed to Dr. Sharma, who translated aloud to James O'Coffer. Nadia, via Sharma, "That's it. That's exactly what it should feel like. Don't change a single note." The rehearsal room was silent for a moment. Then the principal oboist, a man of 60 who had been playing for 40 years and had seen most things an orchestra can produce, began to applaud. He was followed, one, by the rest of the 80 musicians. Nadia felt the applause through the floor before she turned around to see it. 7. Breakthrough and Resolution. The Night the World Listened. Royal Festival Hall, London. The premiere. The premiere was scheduled for the last Friday of November. It sold out in 11 hours. Nadia arrived at the Royal Festival Hall at 2 o'clock in the afternoon for the final technical check. She walked the stage barefoot. Shoes and the feel of the floor were inextricably connected for her, and she needed to understand this floor, the specific acoustic properties that would translate through the boards into her feet when the orchestra played. She stood at the conductor's podium. She felt the dimensions of the stage through the soles of her feet. She walked to the center of the stalls, where the audience would be, and stood with her eyes closed for a long time, lining the space by its stillness. She returned to the green room. Her mother, Anne, was there, silver-haired now, still with the particular expression she had worn since the evening she found Nadia under the piano, the expression of someone watching something they always believed was possible, finally proving itself to be so. Anne signed to Rebouter. Nadia read her hands. "Anne, are you frightened?" Nadia thought about this honestly. "Nadia, I've been composing in silence for 20 years. Tonight they'll hear it. I don't know what that sounds like. Maybe frightening is the right word, or maybe it's just very large." Anne pressed her hand. Nadia pressed back. At 8 o'clock, James O'Coffer walked to the podium. He looked out at the 1,200 people in the hall. He looked to the front row, where Nadia sat with her feet flat on the floor. He raised his baton. The first movement began. Nadia felt it before she consciously registered that she was feeling it, the low strings opening the work, a C so far below the standard register that it was felt more than produced, a pressure in the chest that she had described in her score notes as the weight of something that has been silent for a very long time. She felt it in her sternum. She felt the floor beneath her feet begin to carry it. She pressed her palms onto her own thighs and felt the vibration of the hall itself. And she understood for the first time in 31 years what it felt like for her music to exist in the world outside her own body. She had always known what it felt like inside her. The compositions existed in her haptic memory with the clarity and precision of something real, but they had always been internal, a world of one. Tonight, for the first time, they were external. They were in the hall. They were in the bodies of 1,200 people who could not feel them the way she could feel them, but who were receiving them nonetheless. The music was leaving her and entering the world, and it was doing so through the ears of people who had been told for years that a deaf woman had nothing worth hearing. The third movement, the one she had rebuilt with Dr. Sharma, the air into vacuum movement, lasted 19 minutes. Partway through, she realized the hall had gone absolutely silent in a way that had nothing to do with the music playing. The particular silence of an audience that has stopped thinking and started feeling. She could not hear it, but she knew. When the final note of the fourth movement died, a high violin diminuendo that Nadia had described in her notation as the specific sensation of light leaving, there was a silence of approximately 4 seconds. Then the Royal Festival Hall stood up. All 1,200 of them, together. Nadia felt the vibration of it through the floor before she could process what was happening. She felt the stamp of feet, the movement of bodies, the low and massive rumble of applause that she would never hear, but that passed into her through every surface she was touching, the chair, the floor, the armrest, the air itself. She stood. She pressed both hands flat against her chest. It was a gesture she had used since childhood, since the first time she lay beneath the piano, the gesture of someone receiving something through the bones rather than the ears. She felt every single vibration. The performance was live-streamed to 43 countries. The clip of the standing ovation and of Nadia, hands on chest, eyes closed, receiving it through the floor, was watched 11 million times in the following week. The BBC documentary, made from the workshop footage, won a BAFTA. 3 major orchestras contacted the South Bank Center within a month to inquire about touring the work. Most significantly, the score itself, published with Nadia's full haptic notation system included as an appendix, was adopted by the Royal Academy of Music as a teaching text on composition methodology. The appendix was titled The Architecture of Silence. The introduction was a single paragraph written by Nadia. I have been composing in silence my entire life. What this score will teach you, if you are willing to learn it, is not how to compose without hearing. It will teach you that hearing, the physical, bodily, total experience of music as something received by the whole organism, has always been available to you. You simply did not know how to practice it. Now you do. 9. The lesson. What silence taught the world. What Nadia Clarke's story teaches. Nadia Clarke speaks at things now, though she prefers workshops to lectures, and prefers workshops where she can have people press their hands against instruments to speeches where people sit still and listen. She says that listening without moving is only half of what listening can be. She tells groups, students, musicians, anyone who will sit still enough, the honest version of her story. Not the version that moves in a clean arc from struggle to triumph, the version with the 19 rejections and the conductor's kind letter that was the cruelest thing anyone said to her, and the Tuesday night lying on the floor above the spin class, and the email she sent at 11:40, not knowing whether it would be the last thing she tried. She tells them these things not to be inspiring, she is somewhat impatient with inspiration as a goal, but to be accurate. And she tells them what she learned. 1. Your limitation is not the obstacle, it is the methodology. Nadia did not succeed despite being deaf, she succeeded through it. The haptic notation system, the physical mapping of vibration, the architecture of silence, these were not workarounds, they were the method. Her limitation became the instrument she composed with. 2. Fight the right battle. She spent 6 years trying to convince people her music was worth hearing. The turning point was when she stopped asking people to trust her and started asking them to find out. The email to the South Bank Center was not a plea, it was a proposal. The difference is everything. 3. The audience you cannot reach is not your audience. Every door that closed was closed by people who needed to hear music with their ears. Nadia's work was not for those people, or not only for them. It was for anyone willing to receive music through the whole body. That audience was always there. She simply had to find the room large enough to hold them. 4. Silence is not the absence of sound, it is the presence of everything else. This is Nadia's own formulation, and she means it technically rather than poetically. In the absence of auditory information, every other sensory data becomes more precise, more available, more usable. The silence was not a disadvantage. It was 30 years of undivided attention to the rest of the world. I named it Scream because I had been told for years that I had nothing to say. The symphony was my answer, not an argument, an answer.